Welcome, everybody, to a special post-game edition of All In with Art Stapleton, a New York Giants podcast brought to you by NorthJersey.com and The Record. I am your host, Art Stapleton, from one of the coaches' boxes here in the press box at MetLife Stadium. It is now Monday morning, and the Sunday night football affair between the Giants and Chiefs has been over for about an hour and change. Final score, the Kansas City Chiefs 22, the New York Giants 9. And for the third time in the last 6 years, the Giants are 0-3. And had the numbers for you. And let me get that right now. Going back to 1990, 171 teams, including this year, started at 0-3. Only 4 of them made the playoffs, and nobody has started 0-3 and won the Super Bowl. So that's where the Giants are at right now. The reality is that this season is about a lot more than a playoff run or a Super Bowl run. The reality right now is, what will this team do moving forward with the way things are set up, and is it time for Jackson Dart? And I think ultimately, yes, that sounds like a strange sentence to put forth on the show, given the way the offense performed with Russell Wilson at the helm last week in Dallas. But I think what we saw in Chicago today about the Bears and what Caleb Williams and the Bears did to the Dallas defense, I think it's probably more fitting that it is the Alice Cowboys, because there is no D in Dallas. The Giants showed it last week, and Russell Wilson gets a 1-week reprieve, and this offense in general gets a 1-week reprieve, but came crashing down again to the Kansas City Chiefs. And let's be honest, I said this on Friday's show when we had Justin Tuck, before I brought Justin Tuck on. The reality for this offense was going to be simple. Steve Spagnuolo was going to put an umbrella over the back end of the defense. Russell Wilson was not going to beat this team deep. They were not going to allow them to take the shots, split the safeties the way they did with Malik Neighbors and Wan'Dale Robinson against the Cowboys. The Chiefs were just not going to allow them to play that way. They were going to force the Giants to nickel and dime them. They were going to force them to run the ball, which the Giants did pretty well tonight with Cam Skattebo. Tyrone Tracy started off well. Obviously, shoulder injury that he suffers, we'll see where that is. But I can't imagine that Tyrone Tracy is going to be ready to go a week from now. If he had a shoulder injury that was going to keep him out for the game. But, the Giants don't want to play run the ball, because ultimately you're just not going to score. And I think what happened was you get a field goal, and the Gano situation needs to be talked about. But also what happened is they score with Skattebo, and then they missed the extra point. It's blocked. Jamie Gillen came in for Gano. So let's start at the top as we're assessing where this is, and then we'll look where the Giants are going and what I think is going to happen with Jackson Dart. Now I'm going to call up the schedule, because to me that's important for the Dart decision, and we'll get to that in a second. So Gano, we get the announcement in the press box right after the defensive introductions, and I think it was right around the end of the national anthem. And big flag game, season opener at home. You have the big flag on the field, and we get the announcement that Gano is now questionable to kick in the game because he has a groin injury suffered in pregame warmups. Now, talking to Gano after the game, hearing from Brian Daboll, the situation was this. Gano said it was his normal pregame warmup. He didn't come in with any injury. Obviously, last year, week 2 against Washington, that's always going to hang over the Giants and hang over Gano. He came in with a pre-existing injury last year. They didn't call up Jude McAtamney. They ended up having Gano kick on the opening kickoff. Austin Eckler returned that kick, and Gano got hurt trying to make the tackle, pulled his hamstring. Last year, I believe it was a groin injury, but then he pulled his hamstring. This is a right groin injury. Gano said he was going through his usual warm-ups. He felt great. As the defensive introductions are going on, Gano usually finishes up his kicks, and he said he felt something in his groin. So he went to the training staff, they went to Daboll, and that's how they found out. So when the Giants open the game and they get into Graham Gano's range, but obviously they don't have Gano available, they're not going to put Jamie Gillen out there. Look, at face value, on the surface, it's a second guess. If teams lose kickers in this league, it's a random thing. Guys get hurt, and you just have to adjust and adapt to it. But the reality is that when you have a 38-year-old kicker in Graham Gano, who has lost each of the past couple seasons with injuries, and then you stick with him and go into this year, you have to know that at some point you might risk something like this. Now, they've done everything they could possibly do to get Gano ready for this season. He's been very good so far this year. You come out, he tweaks his groin, of course, because the Giants, as we wrote last year and told you on this podcast, it's not Murphy's Law. It's essentially the Mara and Tisch Law. With the Giants, over the last decade, if something could go wrong, it does. And that's exactly what happened tonight. On the first drive that the Giants had, they get into field goal range, but they have to go for it on fourth down because they're not going to kick from that distance where Graham Gano has been automatic, and they instead go for it, and they don't get the fourth down, and they turn it over on downs to the Chiefs. They also missed the extra point, which would have given them a 7-6 lead at the time. Instead, they tie the game with Cam Skattebo's second touchdown in as many weeks. But here's the deal from Gano. From what he said at his locker afterwards, the biggest issue is that once he went into the locker room and got treated by the training staff and they wrapped it up, he didn't know the distance that he'd be able to kick at because now the game is going. And he said when he kicks into the net, you can't judge distance. You can only stay loose. That's what the net is for. It's to stay loose. It's not to judge a distance. So he said when you kick into the net, you don't know if you're kicking at a yard. You don't know if you're kicking at 40 yards. He said so they had to come to a decision and said they weren't going to use him in the first half, even on extra points, that they thought they had a better chance of having Jamie Gillen kick the extra point. And then at halftime, when they would be able to come out and warm up for the second half, Gano could then test his leg and see the distance that he could use. So they found a distance where they felt as though Gano could kick the extra points, and he did. He came out and he kicked the extra point, or actually kicked a field goal from an extra point distance, or even closer than an extra point distance. But the reality is that Gano was going to be a non-factor because they didn't know the risk involved. They didn't know. They thought it was a better chance to have Gillen kick the PAT in the first half. He kicked it. It got blocked. And that's where the Giants stood until Gano's field goal late gave them 9 points in that situation, pulled within 16-9, and then the Chiefs ended up tacking on a touchdown late when Mahomes hit Tyquan Thornton. After Thornton dropped what would have been a touchdown, he went right back to him, hit the slot fade. And it was kind of interesting because the Chiefs challenged the Giants defensively the way the Giants challenged the Cowboys defensively last week. They had no problem. They wanted to strike deep. They really didn't have much success in the short to intermediate, and they attacked deep, and that's where they were able to get things. So, look, the defense played better, but as Brian Burns said afterwards, ultimately, what does it matter? You're not here for moral victories. You're 0-3, and now, you're in a situation where next week you have the undefeated Chargers coming in. And I think for this Giants team, all the talk about the struggles that they had and they would have against this schedule, it's playing out exactly how people predicted. It's a tough schedule. You look at some teams today around the league, and you almost wish that you had the opportunity to play some of the teams that are clearly at the bottom. But you know what? At 0-3, the Giants are clearly at the bottom as well. And that's kind of where it's at. So, all right, let's talk Jackson Dart because I think it's important. Oh, you know what? Before we go to good Dart, one other thing, Andrew Thomas, he was on a snap count tonight. They wanted to play him for 25 plays, wherever that ended up. So as soon as he hit the 25 play mark, they pulled him out. They put Marcus Bowe in. Look, I don't know if it would have been better if they had Bowe and alternate series. They probably felt as though, let's get Andrew his full workload, and then we'll bring Bowe in. I don't fault the Giants or Andrew Thomas for trying to keep him healthy. And now you hope that now you can increase his workload for next week and he can do more. But it was obviously a step down to Marcus Bowe. It doesn't mean Marcus Bowe was a disaster out on the field, but it clearly was a step down from Andrew Thomas to Marcus Bowe. And it should be at this point. Even with Thomas and his limited reps tonight, you saw right away George Karlaftis really gave Bowe a hard time with his power. And we saw all summer that was the biggest thing for Bowe, and that's what he's going to have to work on from year 1 to year 2. He's done a pretty good job with that already. But when he faces guys who can use their power, he might have a little bit more problems as a rookie, just not used to that kind of power. And Karlaftis really got him. I think Karlaftis had 4 QB hits tonight, which is a lot. So Thomas, more next week. Let's see where he's at. Again, there are small chapters to the overarching novel of the Giants. So you got to take the chapters and assess them, but then you could look at the big picture. So let's go to the big picture. The big picture is the fact that the Giants are in a very difficult spot that they put themselves in with Jackson Dart and Russell Wilson. I wrote about it in the story that posted. We posted it on NorthJersey.com about Dart and would he get more snaps tonight. You knew at home if things were going to struggle, you knew that Jackson Dart would get cheers when he came onto the field and there would be boos for Russell Wilson if he came back on the field. The only way that would have changed is if Russell Wilson threw 450 yards because the fans want to see Jackson Dart. And it's compounded by the fact that the Giants are struggling. Russell Wilson can't operate in an offense that needs the patience to be able to use a short passing game or an intermediate passing game. It's just not there, especially when it gets into the red zone. Russell Wilson is 4 of 18 passing with no touchdowns in the red zone. He's obviously thrown for 3 touchdowns on the season. He led the league in passing yardage going into today's action. But ultimately, last week is an anomaly when you consider what the Cowboys did again today against Caleb Williams and the Bears, and also what this offense looked like in week 1 against Washington, and now what it looked like today. So, fast forward. What do the Giants do? Do they bench Russell Wilson and start Jackson Dart? I don't think that is a feasible option for them right now. Should it be? You can make that argument. It could get ugly next week against the Chargers. Chargers are 3-0. Justin Herbert's playing well, and that's where, next week, what are the stands going to look like? What is the reaction? It's only the second home game of the season. You're in September, and now you've set up this back and forth. Now, to Jackson Dart's credit, He handled all the questions at his locker afterwards about as well as you can take it. So, as a Giants fan or as an organization, you listen to Jackson Dart's answers and you say, you know what, that kid gets it. And that's another check in the box when you're deciding, is Jackson Dart ready to play? I just don't know if Brian Daboll believes that Jackson Dart is 100% ready to play and be successful. And I think that is the big picture here, is that, yes, Jackson Dart might provide a spark. But when you go to Jackson Dart, that's it. It's over. Russell Wilson goes to the sideline. You may even be in a situation where you don't want Russell Wilson to be your number 2. You may want Jameis to be your number 2, because then you have the back and forth. What situations are you going to pull Jackson Dart out of a game if he's struggling and go back to Russ? You need to be sure. And it's easy to emotionally make that call. Fans have every right in this building. Media has every right. There may be players in the locker room who look at it and say, you know what? We got to go with Jackson. But let's look at the schedule, okay? You've got winless New Orleans sitting there in week 5, down in New Orleans, right? You got Chargers next week, then you're at New Orleans. Then in week 6, the Thursday night on a short week after New Orleans, you've got the Eagles here. Now, the Giants are in no position where they could punt games, so don't get me wrong. You can't look at that and say, well, we're just going to ride it out, and then we'll bring Jackson later on, because Jackson Dart will not save jobs. Jackson Dart will not keep this franchise afloat. They need to succeed. They need to get some wins. And then you have, after the Eagles, you play at Denver. And then guess what? After Denver, you go to Philly, where last time I checked, you haven't won since 2013. Peyton Hillis was your running back. Eli Manning was the quarterback. Josh Brown kicked 5 field goals. Larry Donnell ran out the back of the end zone. That's the last time you won at Lincoln Financial Field. And then you come back after that game at Philly. You have San Francisco here. And then there's it's at the Bears. Then you play the back. Look, this is where this schedule presents challenges. But all that said, if Jackson Dart is ready, you play him. You don't worry about who you're playing. You just worry about getting the quarterback ready. And if you're Brian Daboll, and you're putting your career here as the Giants head coach on the line with Jackson Dart as your quarterback, yes, you need to be ready. You don't want to put him in a situation that he's not ready for, but you can't be too cute either. And it is going to be ugly here in this building a week from now if all of a sudden you're using the Jackson Dart package and fans are booing Russell Wilson when he's coming back into the field. Look, a week ago, it was a lot easier. Russell Wilson threw for 450 yards. Yes, the Giants lost. It was a very difficult end to the game when he threw the interception. Malik Neighbors took responsibility for the miscommunication. They obviously shared in it. But Russell Wilson did some of the same stuff here. Like, the offensive plan cannot be just chuck it up and duck. And last week it worked against the Cowboys. When it was time to attack, the Giants attacked, and it worked. Today and in week 1 against Washington, it did not work. And this offensive coaching staff needs Jackson Dart to be good, to be functional. Even if it's like this, even if he's up and down, you still need to be able to take that and be confident in where it's headed. And I think right now, if I'm looking at it, if you're saying you're going to Jackson Dart, you can't go back. You can't go back to Russell Wilson. Now, I know back in 2019, the Giants went to Daniel Jones in week 3 and then ended up coming back to Eli Manning late in the year. And, Eli was out there on the field. But the reality is that, you need to be able to do what's best for Jackson Dart and what's best for this team. I don't know how many more games you can have the way you had today, because this offense just was not functional. You got to see Jackson Dart out there. You got to see his instincts. You got to see things take over. But I think that's why I would probably go to Jackson Dart for next weekend, because you play a full game against the Chargers, then you go down to New Orleans in a game that should be a toss-up. At worst, a toss-up. You could be staring at 2 0-4 teams. I'd rather do that than roll Russell Wilson out there again next week. Then you struggle. Then he gets booed off the field. Then you put Jackson Dart in to go to New Orleans. But then you're coming back on a short week after you prepare for your NFL debut as a starter, and you've got Philly here. I think I want to give Jackson Dart more of a runway. And I think by doing that, you give him the start on Sunday against the Chargers. Give him a full week, see where you're at, and go from there. Is that fair to Russell Wilson? Well, off of last week, it's not. But off of today, look, the NFL's not fair. It's not fair for the Giants. What are you going to do? The schedule is tough. Schedule is brutal. You wish you had some of these games early on. Maybe if you played New Orleans today, you'd be sitting there at 1-2. Maybe if you played New Orleans and the Raiders in the first three games, you'd be 2-1, and all of a sudden you'd be talking about, hey, maybe we got a shot in this division. Timing. Timing is everything. And the timing of when the Giants go to Jackson Dart as the starter is a huge, huge decision. So that's where we're at. I thought Jackson Dart after the game was very good. He had plenty of opportunities, was asked questions. He even joked after the interview was over, kind of turned around, whispered to a couple of us guys, those are tough questions. I mean, look, you can't spend 4 months building a quarterback room, having these guys all work together, talk about how it's helped all of them, help this team, and then when things start unraveling a little bit, you can't look at it and go, well, these guys will just have to deal with it. It's not easy. It's not easy for Jackson Dart to go out there and be the number 2, to say the right things after the game, to support Russell Wilson. Russell Wilson has supported him since he's been here. Now, that's what we're told behind the scenes. Russell Wilson has not come out publicly and talked about how upset he is or how wronged he is by having Jackson Dart be here as the number 2. Jameis Winston didn't come out and talk about how upset he is that Jackson Dart is the number 2 and he's the emergency number 3. So all these guys are trying to do their best to work together. And it's not easy. But it's the reality of the NFL. And the reality of the NFL is the clock is ticking. The clock is ticking for the Giants. The clock is ticking on Jackson Dart becoming the quarterback here and showing that he can be the franchise guy. It wasn't easy for Kurt Warner back in 2004 when Tom Coughlin and the organization made the decision to go to Eli Manning. There were a lot of veterans in the locker room who questioned the decision. They were right around 500 in that situation. They still felt like if they put things together, they would be able to get on a little bit of a run. And they felt like the rug was pulled out from under them. You're 0-3. You're the Giants and you're 0-3. Russell Wilson hasn't won a game yet. Do you think he's beating the Chargers next week? I don't. Does Russell Wilson? Probably. Are there guys in the locker room who believe they can beat the Chargers? Maybe. Does Brian Daboll believe that? Does Joe Shane believe that? I'm not so sure. And the 82,000 fans, I'd say a couple thousand, maybe even more, that were wearing red tonight, part of the Kansas City Chiefs, they certainly didn't come in here afraid of what Russell Wilson could do to challenge Patrick Mahomes as far as production-wise with Dak Prescott like they did last week in Dallas. So, like I said, my gut is that the Giants will think long and hard about going to Jackson Dart. I don't know if they will, but I do think that the bigger picture has to play a part here. If you don't go to Jackson Dart this week and then you decide to go to him in New Orleans, then you get a short week coming off of his first game, having to play Philly here on a Thursday night. And that is certainly not how you kind of want that. Everyone wants to assume that when Jackson Dart goes in the game that everything is going to be great. And maybe it will. Maybe you catch fire. Maybe you look at Jaden Daniels from last year and all of a sudden, people are looking at him and saying, boy, we should have started Jackson Dart from game one. Maybe he's a C.J. Stroud and the way C.J. Stroud played 2 years ago. But I can almost guarantee you that if Brian Daboll thought that was going to happen, Jackson Dart would have already been in the game as his starting quarterback. But as I said, the clock is ticking, and I think that's the big thing right now. All right, that's where we're at. We'll have something this week on Jackson and more on the QB decision. So we'll see. Brian Daboll was asked after the game if Russell was still the starting quarterback. He said, just like he said after Washington, that he doesn't make those calls essentially in press conferences after games. So he'll meet with the team, watch the film, that kind of thing. I just don't get that gut feeling that they're going to go to Dart. But they might not have a choice. And that's a position they put themselves in. And Jackson Dart, I'll say it again, Jackson Dart does not save jobs unless he plays well. Unless the Giants get him to play well, they're competitive, and they win some games. Because there's always the flip side. If Jackson Dart doesn't play well, then you give ownership a reason to look at everybody and say, what am I doing here? What are we doing? Is it really worth it? Let's just blow it up. And you don't want that. If you're Brian Daboll, if you're Joe Shane, you don't want to put yourselves in that position. And you certainly don't want that for Jackson Dart. And Jackson Dart doesn't want that for Jackson Dart because he wants to be the quarterback here for a very long time. He wants to follow in Eli Manning's footsteps. And to do that, you've got to hit the timing. And we'll see. See what happens. Couple other notes before we go. Drew Phillips, rough night. Rough night. I know it's easy for us to say from the press box or from watching TV, but that penalty, that defensive pass interference penalty, at that situation, to me, I know it's a lot to expect, but had Drew Phillips just allowed Hollywood Brown to make that catch and then tackled him, the clock would have run out, would have saved them 3 points. Now, do you play that play as a competitor? I've never played corner in the league. I've never played corner at any level of football. So it's somewhat unfair for me to say this is what you should have done. But I think Drew kind of lost his mind a little bit there. He lost where he was, his presence of mind. And I think, those 3 penalties that he had, the 2 illegal contacts, and then that one, there's a reason why he spent most of the second half on the bench, having Cordell Flock kick inside, but then ultimately Phillips went back out on the field, and then he ended up being, unfortunately, on the losing end of the long pass to Thornton that ended up as the touchdown that really put this game away for Kansas City. What else? I mean, the defensive front had its moments, didn't finish enough. I think they'll all look at that and say they didn't finish. What I meant to look at, Abdul Carter, he's going to be right at the top or near the top of snaps played for this defense, playing off-the-ball linebacker in addition to his responsibilities at edge. and I didn't look at it afterwards. They only had him for 4 tackles, a tackle for loss, and a QB hit. I thought he had more than that, to be honest. Cam Skattebo is now your RB1 for the time being. I think if Tyrone Tracy can't be on the field with the shoulder injury, I would imagine Turbo Miller gets elevated. Giants have decisions to make roster-wise there as well. A big play was the Skattebo face mask, the non-call. Brian Daboll was asked about it afterwards, and he basically said, well, I guess they didn't see it. I mean, it was clearly a face mask, and it definitely changed that game, that moment of that game, of that drive. There are plays like that all over, but yeah, that was a terrible call. Terrible. Should have been a face mask. Look, the Chiefs, the only thing they have is offense is Patrick Mahomes. It does remind me of Eli Manning a little bit later in his career. Now, Eli was not creating the way Patrick Mahomes can create, but it was almost like in 2017 when Odell got hurt and all the receivers got hurt, and Eli Manning was just basically like, whatever he could do to carry a team. Now, he's not Patrick Mahomes in that moment. Patrick now at 30 is not where Eli was in that 2017 season. But you feel like in this offense for the Chiefs, if it's not Patrick Mahomes running around and making plays, they're not going to make plays. So, this is not a vintage Chiefs offense. So, to give up 22 points, yes, it's frustrating. But again, another week where you give up 22 points, but your offense doesn't respond. Last week you score 37, but your defense gives up 40. Let's be honest. It's a sign of a bad team. It's a sign of a team that doesn't know how to win. They got to coach better. They got to play better. They got to execute better. And they got to start making their own luck. Because at this point, it feels like they're running out the clock on seasons. And that's not an easy situation to be in. That's how you make regime changes. And I'm not calling for anybody to get fired right now. I know that's the emotional reaction. Daboll needs to go. Shane needs to go. What are they doing? They can't coach. They can't do this. It's 3 games. It's 3 games on the heels of 13 seasons. Don't get me wrong. But you got to give this team a little bit of leeway to try to make some luck, make some things happen for themselves. There's going to be plenty of time if you need to make organizational changes that you're going to make those changes. But give them a chance to make the play at quarterback, to go to Jackson Dart and see what do you got, to see if this defense continues to get better rather than having a moment like last week where it seems like they just couldn't make a play. So that's kind of where we're at right now. And I know you're frustrated. I know as a fan base, it's the same old song. Imagine trying to cover this for 13 years and come up new ways to say some of the same things. But it's not the same. Because right now you have a guy who you think is your franchise quarterback. And it's that ebb and flow, that idea of when to go to him, when not to go to him. Do you want to go to him too soon? If you go to him too soon, do you ruin him? Well, if you're confident that Jackson Dart, and I get it, if you're confident that Jackson Dart can be your franchise guy, you go to him and say, yeah, you know what, he can handle it. But there's a lot to it. There really is. There's a lot to it. And, Jackson Dart hasn't thrown a pass yet. There was one pass play called today for him. It wasn't a zone read, and he scrambled on it because it wasn't there. They didn't cover it the way he thought they were going to cover it. So there's still a lot to learn from Jackson Dart and for Jackson Dart. But I think there's a lot better chance tomorrow than there was after week 1 that we would hear that the Giants might go to Jackson Dart. Do I think that's happening? No, I don't. I think next week, I think they'll probably stick with Russell Wilson against the Chargers. And I think you'll probably see a lot of the same things that you saw defensively from Spags and the Chiefs, from Minter and the Chargers. And then can the Giants solve that? And I'm not sure they can. So maybe next week is the week you give Russell Wilson a half, and then you bring Jackson Dart in to start the third quarter. Talk about after the game how you were looking for a spark, and then he starts against New Orleans the following week. Right now, that would probably be my guess. Probably wouldn't be what I do. I'd probably go to Jackson Dart now. I'd probably go to him as QB1 and say the rest of this season is about what Jackson. Show us Jackson. Give us a different dynamic. Let's bring a different juice, different level of juice. Because right now we've seen 3 games from Russell Wilson. One was out of this world, and the other 2 were really you wanted to really kick out of this world because the offensive performance 2 of the 3 weeks has been a struggle. And will it be the same with Jackson Dart? Not sure. But I can tell you this, if Brian Daboll thought it would be different, he would have gone to Jackson Dart already. Let's see if that is the case moving forward. So that's where we're at. Hopefully you guys are still watching the post-game shows. Appreciate the all-in audience as always. For producer Paul Wood, I'm Art Stapleton. We'll check out here from MetLife Stadium. We'll be back later on this week, assess the situation, see where the Giants are at when they host the 3-0, I was going to say San Diego, LA Chargers, Jim Harbaugh, Justin Herbert, and a very good young defense coming here to MetLife Stadium. So appreciate you being all in. We're all in, and we are all out from MetLife in this early Monday morning. We'll catch you later on this week.